Hi, my name is Bill Thayer, and I'm interested in being a cruise enrichment lecturer. I prepared one short video on aviation. It was one vignette talk of Amelia Earhart. And what I'm doing today is a short vignette on 4 different technology talks. And the reason I'm doing that is 2 reasons. Number one, I want to show that I can speak authoritatively on technology subjects. And number 2, I want to show that, well, technology is kind of interesting, because if you say technology to people, it's kind of like, whoa, I think I'd rather go out and sit at the pool or something like that. But I'm going to show that, well, maybe there's a few people, they show up at computer classes on cruise ships, and there might be just a few more people that might be interested in, say, hearing a talk on robotics or hearing a talk on the Transcontinental Railroad. It may not appeal to everybody, but I think it's going to appeal to somebody. So what's my background? Educationally, I have a bachelor's in science in mathematics from Stanford University. I have equivalent of a bachelor's of science in engineering from UCLA, though I never got the degree. I have a master's in aerospace engineering from USC and an MBA. I worked 30 years in the aerospace industry, 10 years in real estate and finance. I worked in a variety of technical areas, and I've been in technology my whole life, so I've been paying attention to what's going on. For example, at Stanford, one of my professors, Dr. Shallow, was one of the first people that worked on the laser. His brother-in-law, actually Townsend, was the guy that got credit for the laser, inventing the laser, but Shallow worked in it as well. And when I was at Hughes Aircraft, they were the Hughes Research Lab at Malibu was the first one to create an actual physical laser. I visited that lab when I worked at Hughes Aircraft. And I also worked on the airborne laser lab. So that's just one area. I worked in communication satellites from the beginning, aircraft. I know a lot about technology, launch vehicles, etc. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give a short vignette on 4 different topics of technology. These are talks that I've given. I plan to give more, of course. One is on the Transcontinental Railroad. That's what joined the East Coast with the West Coast back in 1869. Another one on robotics, where we're going with robotics in the future. And a 3rd talk on innovation. A 4th talk on Edison's connection to the computer. One line of innovation. So we're going to readjust to the screen here, so be patient. Okay, we're readjusted, hopefully. And why build a transcontinental railroad? Well, the reason was, if you went from New York to California, it took you 6 months if you went around the tip of South America. It took you 2 months by the Panama Canal, but you'd be risking your life because there was yellow fever and malaria down there, and a lot of people died. It would take you 4 months to do the old-fashioned way, like the Oregon Trail, by covered wagon. The Donner Party tried that, and they lost half their people. In fact, the Transcontinental Railroad went through Donner Pass in the Sierras. Okay, here's what the route looked like if you were going around the tip of South America. Could be 5 months, 8 months, who knew? You could sink at sea. It's pretty rough down here. If you wanted to go shorter, you would go to the Isthmus of Panama. Of course, there wasn't a canal back then. And you would go across the Isthmus of Panama, just 50 miles, but very dangerous because of all the malaria and yellow fever, and then sail up there. The other way was to come across by covered wagon. Now here is the Oregon Trail, and the trail to California was a little bit different, kind of paralleled where the Transcontinental Railroad finally ended up going. It was a pretty difficult operation to build the railroad. Now, the toughest thing, the railroad started from 2 ends. From the east, it started from Omaha. From the west, it started from Sacramento. From Sacramento, they had to go over Sierras. And here's a monument to the Donner Party. They lost about half their people. And what's significant about this monument is it's 22 feet high. And that was the depth of the snow that they had to contend with. That's about what the Central Pacific had to contend with in working through the winter in the Sierras. Very, very tough. So one of the things they had to do And I'm sorry, this is an older picture, it's a little out of focus, but they had to make huge snow tunnels with wood so that they could keep the snow off the tracks. That was a difficulty for the Central Pacific. Now, the Union Pacific that was headed to the west from Omaha had a different problem. Between Omaha and Salt Lake City, there were absolutely no cities. So what they had to do is they had to bring their cities on rails with them. And when they came out, these were the dormitories, and they also had cooking cars. But when they came out, they were met by tent cities on the side where, shall we say, entrepreneurs with less than wonderful aspirations brought booze, they brought prostitution, they brought gambling, and these cities were known collectively as Hell on Wheels. Pretty adventuresome. One time there were 24 murders in 25 days, so a pretty rough climate. But despite all the difficulties from east and west, the railroad did meet in Promontory Point, Utah. This is a little north of the Great Salt Lake. So here they are in 1869 celebrating the arrival of the two different locomotives from east and west. And this is what it looks like today. It's a national park. They have replicas that have been reconstructed of the eastern locomotive. You see that as a thin smokestack. That's because it burned coal. And over here you have a great big broad smokestack. That's because the western locomotive burned wood. Second talk I give is on robotics. And of course we're all familiar with robotics in terms of ATM machines and automatic bag check-in at airports. But tomorrow it's going to be driverless cars, maybe Amazon drones delivering stuff to our doorstep. Here's what we're familiar with today. Everybody gets money from an ATM. Everybody checks their bags in at the airport. But what's coming in the future are driverless cars. This is just one example, and what's sitting up here is a laser radar called a LiDAR. But they have a lot of different sensors on the car, and then it goes into a computer, and they figure out and they make the right decision so they don't bump into somebody, they go slow, they figure out if they're going to turn right, left, what they're going to do. That's cars. Here's launch vehicles. Elon Musk, he first was a billionaire courtesy of his work on PayPal, but he formed SpaceX. And in fact, just recently he announced that his ambition is to put an unmanned capsule on Mars by 2018. That's just a couple years from now. And that's going to be all from his private funds. Kind of an amazing guy. Well, what he's doing already that's amazing is he's launching a vehicle. It's coming up here. It's separating. This part's going into orbit, and then the major part of the launch vehicle turns around and it comes back down and it lands. It can either land on a launch pad on the ground, or it can land on a barge in the ocean. And he's done both. Now, Jeff Bezos of Amazon has done the same thing. He's landed twice, and he's used the same vehicle to go for the second launch and land the second time. So he showed that he could use it twice. This, I think, my calculations are if they can reuse one of these launch vehicles 10 times, they probably cut the launch cost in half. And it's an area that I worked in. I just want to authenticate that I did know something about this. This is my reentry physics textbook from 1968. You see these ugly equations that we had to work with. But let's move on to robotics in a different area than launch vehicles. This is for medical reasons. This is surgery. The patient is in here. He's being operated on by robotic arms, but the robotic arms are being controlled by a doctor over here. This is, according to my son, he's a doctor, and he says, oh gee, over 50% of the prostate surgery today is being done by robotic surgery. But there's a lot of other things that are going on in the hospitals that are robotic. You can see these things running up and down the hallway, and they, of course, don't run into you. They'll stop. And what they are is when you open them up, they can be something like a whole bunch of trays of food for dinner or lunch or breakfast, and then somebody doesn't have to run down the cafeteria and bring those trays up. They got a little robot that does it and keeps it warm. Or they could be taking blood samples from what nurses and doctors have taken from patients, put it in here, and this robot will go down to the lab and the techs will run the blood tests. Another thing that's running around in hospitals is something like this. It's a little tower of information so that if, say, you're trying to diagnose something, say somebody's got Wilson's disease, well, maybe you want to be sure that you've got all the characteristics. You go in there and you look at the screen that gives you all the characteristics for Wilson's disease. Or perhaps you're making a prescription for somebody. You want to look at that and make sure it doesn't conflict with any other medicines that are on it. You could do that. Or if you want to talk to an expert in your field on some sort of diagnosis, as long as you can get them, you can have a little FaceTime discussion when you're right there with the patient or perhaps in the hallway. Switching again to a different type of robotics, this is ocean. So what we've got here is something kind of like the size of a surfboard. It's got some solar cells on it. It's got a little communication and navigation like GPS equipment. And it goes in the ocean, and the unique thing about it, which you can't see here, but you can see down here, is below this, it's got another little submerged vehicle, and it has these things which I call elevators on them, and they'll move up and down depending upon where this craft is on the waves. And the net result of this is it gives the whole craft forward propulsion for nothing. You don't need an electric battery. You don't need a diesel engine. You're not being powered by solar power. It's powered by the waves. And how far can they go? Well, this particular one left Massachusetts, ended up over here in Spain. Now, it didn't do that in 2 weeks. It took a year to do that. But what they can do is they can use these things, because they're not very expensive, they can use these to map the ocean, the currents, the temperatures. And of course, what we're hearing about in the news today is Amazon is looking at using robotic planes to come in here with the orange thing. That's going to have your pair of socks in there, or your shoes, or maybe something else that you've ordered off Amazon. Now you get next day delivery. With these, maybe from the Amazon warehouse, you might get same day delivery to your doorstep. We don't know what's going to happen there. A third talk I give on technology is innovation, and I ask the question: is it dead? Because we've had some pretty prominent and respected economists, Robert Gordon. Got to get back there. Robert Gordon and Thayer Cohen have said, "Hey, you know what? We've invented just about everything we can invent. Everything's slowing down. We can't count on innovation to be a driver for economic growth." So you've got the rise and fall of American growth, the great stagnation. And of course, I'm an engineer. I totally disagree with this. I mean, tell me that you think we've written the last piece of software. We can't innovate? Of course we can innovate. And I'm going to talk about some of the things that we do in innovation. One thing you have to, one of the things that you got to recognize about innovation is it takes a while for new innovation to happen, and it's unpredictable. And I'm going to get to that particularly in my talk on Edison and computers. But every innovator does something, and that makes it easier for the next innovator to just keep the innovation going. So if we look here in just communications, we started out mail by stagecoach in 1800. Well, Samuel Morse's wife died before the stagecoach could get to him. He was painting a portrait of Lafayette in Washington, D.C. His wife was in New York, and by the time he got the message to come home because she was sick, it was too late. She was dead. It took about a week to get there. So that was his inspiration to invent the telegraph, which he did. And then you had instantaneous communication. That was improved by Alexander Graham Bell, where you had not just dots and dashes, but you could actually hear somebody's voice. And Marconi then took that a step further for ships at sea, because of course you couldn't use a telephone. That required a copper line. And what he did is he created wireless. You could transmit something with electromagnetic waves in the air, and you could hear a ship on land using wireless. after that, and I'm leaving a lot of things out, was satellite communications. That's what I worked on in the 1960s. And what satellite communication has the advantage of is a great view all over the Earth. And one of the things that was kind of amazing to me is I was on a cruise down to Antarctica, and I went, gosh, this is really cool. This is a lifetime dream. I'm down in Antarctica on a cruise ship, and I went into where I could send an email. I sent an email to my son. And how did that work? It went up to a satellite, the Merisat satellite. Well, that's what our group worked on in satellite communications. So it was a kind of really a beautiful thing. But satellite communication, that's a little tricky because you've got to use basically microwaves. You can use some other things too. But fiber optics, that's a totally different thing. That's using light waves. And it is far, far more effective to use light waves and lasers in these these fibers that are glass and flexible that take the place of copper wires. Lasers are far more efficient, and I've got a chart on that later on. But what this does with all this advanced communication from going from the telegraph to fiber optics is we've got things like e-books. Nobody needs to have paper books anymore. You can just send it very quickly by our great communication system. And we send information now, and we can print a product, a part, an airplane part with 3D printing. We've got effectively free FaceTime. It's pretty amazing. So is this going to stop? Have we stopped all our innovations? I don't think so. This, of course, shows you the different computer chips we've had over the years, and what they've done is the basic rule called Moore's Law is that you double the amount of transistors on a chip, which means double your computing power or your communication power, whatever you want to think of it. You double it every 2 years. This was a law that it's an empirical law. It's not a law of physics or anything. It's an empirical law by Gordon Moore. But I want to tell you, because I worked in the communication field, is guess what? Fiber optics is doing whatever they're doing on computer chips to a whole different level. You just take a look at the communications here. From the telegraph, this is the speed, the amount of information that you can transfer. You can see it's just going up exponentially. You go to the telegraph, you go to coaxial cables, microwave towers, and then you start getting into light waves. This is what we have with lasers, and I've got another chart on that. This is kind of complicated. It's got stuff like WDM. You don't have to worry about its wave division, multiplexing, but who cares? Basically, the bottom line with this is here's the trend line. Now, transistors are being doubled every 2 years. What this is saying, with fiber optics, your trend is 10 times every 4 years. And we're certainly not done with this yet. Okay, just absolutely amazing. Let me put it in sort of terms that you might understand. With DirecTV, you get 500 channels of TV. And I happen to work on the very first iteration of DirecTV in 1973. But that's 500 channels of TV. In 4 years, with 10 times the communication, well, it says you could do 5,000 channels of TV. Now, maybe not from a satellite, but certainly using fiber optics, you could do that. But I will have to say that what Richard Gordon and Tyler Cohen have said is, well, hey, you know, maybe in some areas we are a little slow in innovation. I would have to agree that in some areas that's true. I would kind of state it this way. We have some areas of our economy that are growing exponentially, some that are good, steady growth, some that are slow growth. And let me give you examples. Obviously, I've given you a couple examples in information technology and communication. That's clearly exponential. Steady growth, well, let's take our farmers. In 1900, 50% of our population was growing our food. Today, it's 2%, of our people, and we're growing 3 times as much. So, tremendous steady progress over 100 years. Slow growth, energy. In 1900, we had coal and oil. Today, we got coal, oil, nuke. We got some other sources. Solar is not there yet, but solar is, you know, hopefully going to be more in the future. But my point is, how much energy do we get out of a barrel of oil in 1900 versus 2000? Well, if we look at this in terms of gasoline in our cars, maybe it's 10 miles a gallon to 40 miles a gallon. Yeah, it's an improvement, but it's not an earth-shaking improvement. Now, my fourth talk is on Edison to computers. And I can guarantee you that if I'm talking on a cruise ship, there will be a bunch of people that know a whole lot more about computers than I do. But that's not the purpose of this talk. The purpose of this talk is really to go back in history and to kind of describe what Edison did was pretty profound and led other people to add on to that, and that eventually got to computers. And that got to computers in a way that was, well, unpredictable, as I'll describe. What Edison did, if I can just put my hand over that, he invented the light bulb with just this red filament in that. So that's a one filament light bulb. And what I'm saying in this talk is when I add a second thing in there, I'm calling it a filament, it's really a collector plate, but we'll say, just for simplicity, it's a second filament. That created things like a detector, with the possibility of using it as a detector. And when DeForest came in and he put what I'll call a third filament, and indeed it was a mesh, really, with an electric charge on it, that created what was first an amplifier and secondly what was an on-off switch for computers. So it was that simple. Edison was just about there. If he'd put in one more filter and he figured out that you could use it as a computer, and there, believe me, there were a lot more things that had to happen to do that, he could have invented the computer. So I kind of talk about innovation from light bulb to the computer, and I'm really just going to talk about this part here. Of course, we go on to the solid-state transistor integrated circuit personal computer. But we started out with the light bulb with one filament. And then we went to two filaments. That's a detector. I'm not going to talk about that in this short vignette. We went to a third filament. That's what DeForest did, and it was first used as an amplifier. I'll say what that is. And then later, in an entirely different use, but still three filaments, it was used as the heart of the computer. So remember what Edison did is he had one filament here, and then he had a detection plate over here. Well, if you move that over here, make that some sort of fluorescent thing on the edge of this, this is all one big vacuum tube, that's kind of your detector. And this is the setup that was used by J.J. Thomson to discover the electron. Of course, the electron wasn't discovered when Edison made the light bulb. So what they did is they had a filament. Now this filament radiates electrons in 360-degree direction. So they collimated that so they get one nice beam of electrons, and that would come out here and it would hit the detector here. And what J.J. Thomson did is he put a couple plates here so that he could put a magnetic field on this electron beam, and he could make it go down there. And this, plus a lot of brilliant analysis, he came up and he said, guess what? I discovered the electron. So it came from, the start was Edison's light bulb. Now here's a different thing with Edison's light bulb. This is Lee DeForest, and he put in that, what I'll call a third filament. It was really a mesh between the filament emitting electrons and the plate collecting electrons. And you could put a positive charge on that. It would make more electrons want to come across to the collector plate, which was effectively an amplifier. And this is what it was, one of the things it was used for. In 1912, you could not make a transatlantic or transcontinental phone call from New York to San Francisco. The signal was just too weak. But what they did is they had repeating stations that used DeForest repeating. These are the three filament bulbs here. And with just three repeating stations, they were able to make a transcontinental phone call. So you'd have one in Ohio, one in Missouri, one in Salt Lake City, and you would be able to pick up the phone, call somebody in San Francisco. So for years and years, the three filament light bulb, and I realize that's probably a little stretch on words, three filament light bulb was used as an amplifier big time in the telephone world, but also in the radio world. However, the really gigantic step forward with this three filament light bulb was made here at Bletchley Park. This is in England. It's located halfway between Oxford and Cambridge because that's where the smart people of England agreed to meet during World War II to try to break the German code. And what they were trying to do was break the code of this Enigma machine. and they would type in letters here, would come out gibberish. It would not look like a German sentence at all if you intercepted the radio transmission over the air, because it had three little rotors here. It had very complex electrical wiring, and it had trillions of combinations that you would have to try to break the code. The Germans just thought that it couldn't be done. In fact, it was done. The Poles did it for a while, and then the Germans changed the code, and the Poles couldn't keep up with it. What the Poles did, is they invented this thing called the bomb, and they were little, effectively, dials that you would dial around, and you would try different combinations to try to break the German code. Later, the French got it, and then it came over to Britain, and they expanded on it. So you would have these machines, and what you had is you would try different combinations. Believe me, they had to try just millions of different combinations before they broke the German code. And what they would have is these women come in and turn the dial, and then they would shoot electric current through there and see if they broke the German code. That didn't work. Then everybody come back, and they were doing this with 20 different machines, with women doing the twisting and turning of this. But that's very, very slow. So some of the guys said, well, maybe we can do this faster with electronics, and they got a guy, D.C. Flowers, and he designed something with the three-filament light bulb that was the third filament being added by Lee DeForest. And instead of using it for an amplifier, with this third filament, if you changed the central mesh or the central filament from a positive to a negative, you could either attract electrons to the collector plate or keep them away. Effectively, you don't have to worry about that. Effectively, it's an on-off switch. And that was the basis for computers. Now later the Americans did this. They had 1,500 tubes in England. The Americans, of course, did it a lot bigger. They had 15,000 tubes. That was the famous ENIAC computer. And they had women that were operating the machine again. And one of the things they had to do was to change out the tubes that burned out, and frequently the cause of the burnout was they would have a moth or something land on a tube, just like they're attracted to light bulbs. They would land on a tube and they would get in there and they would burn the tube out. So the women would have to figure out which tube was black, go in there, change the tube out. And so what they called that was debugging. And the term is still stuck today with debugging software. Now, it was really debugging hardware is where it originated from, but that's where it is. So this is kind of the end of a vignette of 4 talks on technology. Again, these talks may not appeal to everybody on a cruise ship, but I think there's a certain element that would enjoy the intellectual stimulation of hearing a technology talk. Thank you very much.